Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You know who this is. This is Dr. Soul Brother coming at you with a remedy to help cure your ills. I want to say greetings to everybody. Hope everybody's well. I'm not going to be long, but I'm going to get to the point. I thought it fitting that I try to pay homage to one of my heroes, somebody I've learned a lot from, even though I never got a chance to meet him, and that is Professor Dr. John Henrik Clarke. He is somebody I've learned a lot from over the years. I enjoy looking at his lectures, listening to his lectures, and reading his scholarship. Dr. Clarke was somebody who was very nuanced. Um, you know, we need to learn and know the difference between myopic and panoramic. Dr. Clarke was clearly panoramic. He was somebody who he dealt with African history in terms of continental Africa, but he also dealt with African American or Black history here in the United States. It was not an either or, it was both and. And no disrespect to Dr. Ben, who was his comrade in arms, but for Dr. Soul Brother personally, I'm more a John Henry Clarke man than a Dr. Ben man. But that's me. Um, for one thing, Professor John Henry Clarke dealt with our history here in the United States. Um, you can't say that about Dr. Ben. Dr. Ben's main or sole focus was African history. That's fine and all. I have no problem with that. But I'm just saying Dr. Clarke could delve into our. Not only that, he could also go into the history of the Caribbean. Again, that's part of what I meant when I say um, panoramic, and that was Dr. Clarke. He could break down stuff in ways and whether you were a PhD person or a second grade dropout, he could break that stuff down. In fact, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say this: that in many ways he could break down the history of the Caribbean better than some Caribbean folks, and by extension, break down the history of various different African societies better than some of the continental Africans. Okay, and that's real talk. But I want to address something here. I said I'm not going to be long, but I'm going to get to the point here. Dr. John Henry Clarke, born January 1st, 1915. Interestingly, he was the same. He and uh, Professor Dr. John Hope Franklin uh, they were both born the same year, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe the same month. But at any rate, John Henry Clarke is somebody who taught many, many people and could, as I said, break down various different things in terms of our history and could show what was happening to black folks here in the United States um, during slavery, post slavery, what was happening um, to black folks in the Caribbean, and what was happening to black folks in the different parts of Africa, all at the same time. In other words, was showing what was happening in the black world simultaneously. Dr. Clarke scholarship is impeccable. Impeccable. This is a man who, one of the reasons why I embrace somebody like John Henry Clarke is because he could see and point out the nexus between black folks in America and black folks in the Caribbean. And while he did that, at the same time, he would also cite um, something that would be referred to as Caribbean chauvinism that existed. And the thing that bothers me, frankly, is this. Professor John Henry Clarke his name seems to fly out of the mouths of some of y'all who are on social media. And not just the ones on social media, even those who are not on social media. You quote Dr. Clarke, you reference him, you big him up, and I'm not talking about everybody, but some of y'all who do this, you're the same ones who seem to have a dim view as it relates to uh, Black American culture here in the United States. Well, Dr. Soul Brother got a problem with that. That's a huge problem. And it's a huge contradiction. The contradiction is glaring. I just said a moment ago that John Henry Clarke was a professor, John Henry Clarke, pardon me, was somebody who had a very panoramic view and could break down stuff that was happening in various parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and here in the United States. All that was happening simultaneously on a positive tip. Okay. And yet, some of you have chosen, hear me, chosen to be Team Caribbean and seem to feel that Africans and Caribbeans are superior to Black America. That's an issue. That is an issue. And to you, I say, who do you think you are? Really, who do you think you are? Dr. Clarke didn't do that. If you doubt what I'm saying, look into his scholarship as well as lectures that are right there on YouTube that you can pull up. And he goes into our history. And the thing that bothers me also, um, some of these lectures go back to the mid to late 80s, some early 90s. Because, unfortunately, we lost Dr. Clarke in July of 1998. So these lectures were done some years before his passing. And he was someone, again, who embraced his Black American culture and history in this country, and simultaneously um, saluted the history of the Caribbean on a positive tip, and also the different African cultures throughout the continent of Africa. So, to you who have chosen to be um, Team Caribbean, and I'm not just talking about the ones who are these YouTube historians. I'm also talking about some of these ones who are on the college campuses, be they HBCUs like Howard or the white schools. You need to take a page out of John Henry Clarke's book, and until and unless you're going to do that, until and unless you do that, you need to keep Dr. Clarke's name out your mouth. I'm gonna say that again. Until and unless you do that, take a page out of Dr. Clarke's book, you need to keep his name out your mouth. Period. Because there's a contradiction, especially when you have these younger folk who some of them were not born yet when Dr. Clarke was on the scene, and some of them who were very young at the time. You need to take a page out of Dr. Clarke's book. Remember now, this is a man who embraced his Afro Americana. And if you doubt what I'm saying, go back and watch the interview on Black Journal with Tony Brown, going back to 1973. You can see it on YouTube. And he proudly talked about the Afro American identity. Okay? So, to you who are out here who want to say, we're Africans and we're not Americans and all that kind of stuff, Afro American was fine with Dr. Clarke. So it was fine with him. It should be fine for you. But that's a different topic because at some point down the road, I'm going to deal with that Afro American identity in the not too distant future. In fact, at some point, Dr. Soul Brother, one of the things I'm going to be doing different this year, and that is having a live stream where it's open for conversations with people because I want to be able to engage folk. Okay. Um, this me just doing a monologue, all that's cool and all, but I want to be able to engage people. That's what I'm pushing for. But anyway, I digress for a second. I said I'm gonna wrap things up because I said I'm not gonna be long. Just make this brief, but to the point. John Henry Clarke is somebody who needs to be talked about more. He needs to be taught to your babies. And let your children know who Dr. Clarke was, and the kind of person who took no prisoners, who was a force to be reckoned with. A force. This is a man who could break down Reconstruction and talk about the sharecropping system, which is nothing but a continuation of the slave system on the plantation. It's a cruel system. It's a terrible system. And what was happening in the Caribbean. One of the other things that Dr. Clarke did that I appreciate and will always salute him for is that again, he dealt with the nexus connection, meaning between um, black culture in this country and black culture in the Caribbean, specifically the Anglophone Caribbean. But also, he did this. Um, he was courageous enough to point out how, when it came to the whole thing with uh, um, bravery, he made it clear that black folks in the Caribbean were not braver than black folks here in the United States. That was clear. And it's also clear it's an unfair comparison to make on that level. What do I mean by that? Okay. This is where I'm going to quote General Colin Powell when he said in his memoirs, um, black people in the Caribbean were subjected to what was called absentee landlordism. Black folk in the United States were a minority surrounded by a hostile white majority. Okay? And I'm going to add this. As a result, there's a paradigm distinction. A paradigm distinction. So we need to be real clear on that. Real clear on that. And um, John Henry Clarke is somebody who was a close comrade, confidant of Malcolm X. Um, and in fact, he had a lot to do with Malcolm X's development, especially post Nation of Islam. But that's a whole nother discussion, and I plan to address that as well in the not too distant future. But let me move on. Um, John Henry Clarke again could break down what was happening in the Caribbean in ways that even some folks from the Caribbean right now could not break down. Um, he did not embrace African history, African culture, Caribbean history, Caribbean culture at the expense of his Black American culture, something that some of you are out there under the sound of my voice have been and continue to be guilty of. And if you fool with me, I'll start name dropping. But you know who you are. Okay? You know who you are. Some of these folks who talk about settler state, and all this kind of stuff, and try to disabuse black folks in America of our American identity and that sort of thing, you are out of line and out of order. And this is um 2024. We're not going for that. Period. We are forging forward. So folks sitting back, not saying a word, just grinning and bearing it and all that kind of stuff, that day is done. Done, done, done. And I would highly recommend that um, we study the history of John Henry Clarke, that we study um, the lectures that are left behind that you can see for free on YouTube, interviews, etc., and share those with your children. Share those in the community, especially in today's environment. You have a lot of young people, they're not familiar with somebody like uh, Professor Dr. John Henry Clarke. Well, they need to be educated about who he was, his relationship with Malcolm X, um, his outlook on Marcus Garvey, um, the role that he played in our community in terms of his scholarship, etc. Need to be exposed, and you're duty bound as a black person to expose your children, to his history and legacy. So again, I'll close with this: long live the spirit of John Henrik Clarke, a man born in a rural town in Alabama and then grew up in Columbus, Georgia, January 1st, 1915. So I will do what I can. And that's a hard, tough thing to do. Those are some big shoes to fit in. But I will do what I can with my scholarship to be, if I can be, and I say this with a great deal of humility, but if Dr. Soul Brother could do just a third of the work that John Henry Clarke has put in, then I've made my mark. But in order to make my mark, I got to roll my sleeves up, put my shoulder to the wheel, and pull. And I would encourage those of you who are, excuse me, under the sound of my voice to do that, to really do that. Because right now we're lacking true scholars, true scholars. You have some people who are in the academy, they can't shine his shoes, hardly any of them right now. And you know it's true. So, on that note, I will say, Aluta continua, the struggle continues, and until the next time, God bless.